I recently had a conversation with Russ Brialt, an expert of the Shroud of Turin, which is an artifact thought to be the burial cloth of Jesus Christ. Russ has been studying the Shroud for over 30 years, and after our conversation, I realized that many of the historic names, locations, and other artifacts involved in the history of the Shroud can get really confusing. You might not believe it, but you could spend a lifetime studying this guy right here and still not cover everything. So before I released that episode, I decided to film this short video to summarize the history of the Shroud so you can better understand the conversation. This will serve as the first of a series on the Shroud of Turin, discussing the authenticity and the impact throughout the ages. Now, the history I'm about to present is controversial and not really agreed upon by everyone. In fact, I myself am quite skeptical of a lot of it. This is because I'll be presenting the history from the perspective of someone who thinks the Shroud is authentic. And even among authentic presenters of the Shroud, they still disagree on the history. I'm not here to affirm one side or the other. That will be for future conversations. But instead, this video is for those who are unfamiliar with the history and the context and all the theories surrounding this mysterious object.
Wow.
So if you're a firm Shroud enthusiast or someone who hates anything and everything to do with Christianity, welcome. Let's learn something new together. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Truth and Tradition. My name is Jackson, and on this podcast, I interview scholars on the intersection of religion, science, and philosophy. If that sounds interesting to you, then hit that subscribe button. This helps the channel get seen by more people, and it's a free way to support the podcast. As I said before, the Shroud of Turin is thought to be the burial cloth of Jesus. So, of course, that is where our story begins. Back around 30 to 33 AD, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified, and according to John 19:38 to 41, he was wrapped in linen and buried in a new tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Now, the passage says that Jesus was wrapped in strips of linen, not a singular linen cloth like the Shroud of Turin. However, other accounts, like in Matthew, mention just a singular linen cloth. So most people say that both strips of linen were used in addition to the shroud itself, as a way of holding the body all together. Scholars have even found a long strip of linen sewn onto the shroud's side, which might be the strips of linen that the author of John is referring to. The passage also mentions a face covering in John 20 verse 7, which is also important. This is thought to be the Sudarian of Oviedo, another relic that has its own history. All you have to know is that the Sudarian of Oviedo is the face covering of Jesus, while the Shroud of Turin is the cloth wrapping Jesus' body. In John chapter 20, Peter and John arrive at the tomb of Jesus and find that he is no longer there. It says that they saw the linen and the face covering, and then it says that John saw and believed. Thus, the burial shroud of Jesus was the evidence John needed to believe in the resurrection. In fact, a later 6th century translation of this verse by the Mozarabic Rite interpret this verse as follows. Peter ran with John to the tomb and saw the recent imprints of the dead and risen man on the linens. As Russ Brialt puts it, the shroud is the receipt for Jesus' payment of sin. From there, it is thought that the shroud and the face cloth were both held in Jerusalem by James, Jesus' brother. But these artifacts do not stay in Jerusalem for very long. The next part of our tale brings us north to Edessa, a city in modern-day Turkey. A couple of late 4th century documents tell a story about Jesus refusing to heal the king of Edessa. Instead, Jesus says that he will send one of his disciples to heal the king after his ascension to heaven. These documents tell the story of Addai after Jesus' death and resurrection. Addai is also known as Thaddeus, who's thought to be one of the 70 followers of Jesus that Jesus sends out in the Gospels. The disciple Thomas sends Adia Thaddeus to go and heal the king of Edessa, Agbar V. So Thaddeus does as he's told, and he travels north to Edessa to heal King Agbar. Now, you might be asking, what does the Shroud of Turin have to do with any of this? Well, the interesting thing is the earliest sources we have of this story make no mention of an image, a cloth, or anything to do with the Shroud of Turin. But a later telling of the story does mention an image of Jesus. One that dates back to the 11th century has Jesus saying this when King Akbar first comes to him to ask for healing. Jesus says, "If you wish to see my face in the flesh, behold, I send to you a linen, on which you will discover not only the features of my face, but a divinely copied figuration of my entire body." Based on the later tellings of the story, it is thought that the shroud was brought from Jerusalem to Edessa with Thaddeus, and that Thaddeus healed the king by presenting the image of the shroud to the king. It is at this point in our story that the shroud and the face cloth are separated, and it is thought that the face cloth, the Sudarium of Oviedo, is brought to Alexandria in Egypt before eventually ending up in Oviedo, Spain in 631 AD. The Sudarium has its own history, which you can learn about elsewhere. But I'm bringing it up because it's very important when talking about the Shroud of Turin, and a lot of shroud enthusiasts discuss it when we're talking about aging the shroud. I won't be referring to it for the rest of this video, but I'm sure it will come up in future conversations, so stay tuned. Now back to the burial cloth. This stays in Edessa for the next few centuries, and it becomes known as the MANDYLION of Edessa. The MANDYLION of Edessa is historically attested as an image of Jesus' face, but not his whole body. Folks who believe in the shroud's authenticity, though, believe the MANDYLION of Edessa to be the same thing as the Shroud of Turin. The thought is that only the face region of the shroud was shown to the public at this time, and that the rest of the cloth was folded up, and so that's why it's known as being a facial image and not a full body image. The shroud does have visible fold patterns that people point to as evidence of this hypothesis. Now, in 944 AD, several centuries later, the Byzantine Emperor Romanos I makes a deal with the rulers of the city of Edessa, which is no longer under the control of Christians, but has now been taken over by the Muslim nation. In order to bring the MANDYLION to Constantinople under Christian domain, the rulers of Edessa agreed to the emperor's request, and the MANDYLION is then brought from Edessa to Constantinople with a big procession. And once it arrives in Constantinople, an archbishop delivers a sermon to all the spectators. Shroud enthusiasts use this sermon to link the MANDYLION of Edessa to the Shroud of Turin. Our earliest manuscripts of this sermon, dating to about the 11th or 12th century, quote the archbishop as saying this: "The splendor has been impressed uniquely by the drops of agony sweat sprinkled from the face. These are truly the beauties that produce the coloring of the Christ's imprint, which has been embellished further by the drops of blood sprinkled from his own side. Blood and water there, sweat and image here." Because of this quotation, it's thought that the MANDYLION must be more than just the face of Jesus, but the entire body, including the side wound, as he mentions. The side wound, which, lo and behold, is on the shroud and corresponds to the Gospels. The shroud then stays in Constantinople until 1204. Now, pay attention to this next part, because there's going to be a lot of names and places, so feel free to take notes. In 1204, there's a mention of a shroud of Jesus being venerated at a church called St. Mary of Blackernay. It is mentioned by a French knight named Robert de Clary, who says the following: "On every Friday, that shroud did raise itself upright, so that the form of our Lord could clearly be seen. And none knows, neither Greek nor Frank, what became of that shroud when the city was taken." You see, 1204 is a significant year for Constantinople because it is at this time that the city was sacked by Crusaders. The Crusaders were on their way to fight in the Holy Land when they got themselves into some debt. And after Plan A failed for getting themselves out of that debt, they decided to just pillage the city. Problem solved. Well, in this raid, this huge skerfuffle, the Crusaders stole tons of gold, silver, and most notably, religious relics. In 1205, a relative of the Byzantine Emperor Theodore Angelus of Constantinople complained about the raid to the Pope at the time. He says that in April last year, a crusading army, having falsely set out to liberate the Holy Land, instead laid waste to the city of Constantine. During the sack, troops of Venice and France looted even the holy sanctuaries. Most sacred of all, the linen in which our Lord Jesus Christ was wrapped after his death and before the resurrection. We know that the sacred objects are preserved by their predators in Venice, in France, and other places. The sacred linen in Athens. Theodore Angelus says the shroud was taken to Athens, Greece, and some say it was taken to Athens by a man named Othon de la Roche. God, I love that name. After the raid, Othon was rewarded territory in Greece, which included Athens, and he became the Duke of Athens. Suspicious? I think so. If anyone took the shroud to Athens, Othon would be a great suspect. Now, information about the shroud pretty much goes blank at this point, but some suggest that Othon passed it on to his descendant, eventually ending up in the hands of Jeanne de Vergy of Burgundy, France. You see, both Othon de la Roche and Jeanne de Vergy were from noble families in Burgundy, France, families which intermarried, making it possible for Jeanne to be Othon's descendant. Now, a late anonymous source from the 18th century, MS 826, suggests that Othon donated the shroud to Bishop Amadeus de Tremblay, who gave it to a cathedral in Besançon, France. Besançon, give me the cheese from Besançon. Now, a Jean-Jacques Chifflet, a 17th century writer, wrote about a shroud in St. Stephen's of Besançon Cathedral. Forgive me, guys, for all the French names. I might be butchering them. Now, Chifflet says that the shroud of Jesus was displayed at this cathedral, St. Stephen's, every Easter Sunday, once a year. These sources, as I mentioned, are many centuries later, 17th, 18th century, but they mention earlier sources that are now lost. And many speculate that these earlier sources were destroyed by a fire at St. Stephen's in 1349. The general idea, though, is that Othon's supposed descendant, Jeanne de Vergy, was responsible for the shroud while it was at St. Stephen's. And after the 1349 fire, it is suggested that Jeanne took the shroud to LIREY and gave it to her new husband as a dowry. Now, a lot of that is just speculation, and there's not a lot kind of backing it up historically. But our first strongly attested reference to the Shroud of Turin comes at this point in history. Jeanne marries Geoffrey de Charnay, who everyone and their mom believes to have truly been in the possession of the Shroud of Turin. For skeptics, this is where the story of the Shroud of Turin begins, suggesting that Geoffrey either paid an artist to put it together or he was gifted it by some person. Geoffrey de Charnay presented the Shroud of Turin in his church in LIREY from 1353 to 1356. Many pilgrims then came to visit the shroud, and Geoffrey accepted offerings from the traveling pilgrims. Now, the bishop over this region, Henry de Portier, took notice of this shroud and decided to investigate its authenticity. And he concluded that the shroud is a fraud. He states that after diligent inquiry and examination, the Lord Henry of Portier, of pious memory, then Bishop of Troyes, discovered the fraud and how the said cloth had been cunningly painted, the truth being attested by the artist who had painted it. The shroud then stops being displayed after Henry's investigation, but years later, in 1389, Geoffrey's son, Geoffrey de Charny II, writes to the Pope of Avignon, France, a competing pope to the Pope of Rome. This pope is Clement VII of Avignon. Whew. That's a lot of names. Geoffrey de Charny II then writes to Pope of Avignon and asks for permission to venerate the shroud once more, as it once was by his father. Pope Clement allows it, but only with the stipulation that it be presented as a representation of the burial shroud and not the real burial shroud itself. Now, let's pause here for a second and talk about a different document that dates to this very time in the 14th century. You might have heard that there's a new document that was recently found that corroborates the dating of the Shroud of Turin to its 14th century date. This document was found last year in 2024 and was presented for the first time to the public in 2025, just a few months before this video is coming out. This document would have been written between when the shroud was first presented by Geoffrey I and when it was later presented by his son, Geoffrey II, in 1389. The document, which itself dates between 1370 and 1383, comes from a cleric in Normandy named Nicole Orisma, who says the following: "I do not need to believe anyone who claims someone performed such a miracle for me, because many clergymen thus deceive others in order to elicit offerings for their churches. This is clearly the case for a church in Champagne, where it was said that there was the shroud of the Lord Jesus Christ, and for the almost infinite number of those who have forged such things and others." This matches the history presented by Bishop Darcis of Troyes, the one who's basically telling everything that's happening by the Charny family at this point in history. Bishop Darcis of Troyes is the guy that succeeded Henry de Poitiers as bishop over Troyes. And for those who might have forgot, Henry de Poitiers is the guy who investigated the shroud and found the artist and said that it was painted. Now back to the story. Geoffrey II agrees to Pope Clement's stipulation to present it as just a replica, and the Shroud of Turin is presented once more in LIREY until 1453. Fast forwarding to 1453. In 1453, Geoffrey's descendant, Margaret de Charny, gives the Shroud of Turin to the House of Savoy. Now, the Savoy family present the shroud as an authentic burial shroud of Jesus, and this decision receives no pushback because enough time had passed for people to forget Pope Clement's stipulation, and now it can be presented as a real, authentic artifact. It stays in the House of Savoy for many, many years. And notably, in 1532, while in the possession of the Savoy family, a fire breaks out and burns the shroud. When you look at the Shroud of Turin, one of the things that stands out most on the artifact are the two parallel lines that run the length of the shroud. Well, these are the burn marks from the 1532 fire, which was then patched up and rewoven in several different places. Finally, in 1578, Duke Emmanuel Philibert moves the Shroud of Turin to Turin, Italy, which is where it resides to this very day, and gives it its modern name, the Shroud of Turin. Woohoo! Now, the shroud has been publicly presented, written about, and scientifically examined several times since this date in 1578. I'll be discussing that in future episodes, but I hope this fills in the historical gaps and contextualizes this ancient artifact. Let me know your thoughts below. Is the shroud a true, authentic relic? Is it the true burial cloth of Jesus? Or is it a 14th century forgery? I want to say that a lot of this is new to me as well. I recently have been researching all of this, and so I probably got things wrong in the presentation. If you're more familiar with the Shroud of Turin than I am, feel free, correct me. Please do correct me, and I will put those corrections as a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. Now, if you enjoyed this overview, give the video a like and consider checking out my follow-up conversation with Russ Brialt when it drops. For those watching this in the future, it will be the video right here on the screen right now. Thank you so much for listening. Let's keep on searching for solutions to life's biggest questions. I'll see you in the next one.